Do official statistics provide an adequate basis for the debate about the UK economy? What I'm going to say is essentially what I was planning to say in the debate. So what I'm going to say is polemical rather than a measured account. And I'm going to concentrate on three examples. The fuller text of what I'm going to say can be found shortly, hopefully, on that website there, www.cuthbert1.pwp.louisunder.co.uk. So as I said, I'm not going to try to say everything that's wrong with official statistics, in my view. I'm going to give three examples where things have gone badly wrong, I'll argue. But conversely, I'm not seeking to give a balanced account. There's loads that's very good about official statistics, but I'm not going to be giving credit for that. So please bear that in mind. The three examples I'm going to be looking at are how PFI schemes are reflected in national accounts, utility pricing, and funding the UK current account deficit, or the UK as a large bank. The first two topics I've worked extensively on, along with Margaret. We've done considerable amount of joint research on both of these first two topics. So let's plunge into PFI, and how PFI schemes are reflected in the national accounts. What is PFI? Well, a public sector client contracts to make regular payments over 25 or 30 years, typically, for the provision of a serviced asset, like a school or a hospital. So it's getting the use of the school or the hospital together with a number of services, janitorial, etc., connected with the use of the building. It was invented in the UK by the Conservatives, and it's large. By the beginning of this year, PFI contracts have been signed involving capital assets worth £43 billion. And PFI was deliberately designed so that the capital assets would be off the government books. The key aspect of the original test to determine whether a PFI scheme would be off the books was based upon the amount of risk transferred to the private sector. If enough risk is transferred, then the asset should be off the books. But in fact, from the early days of the scheme, some assets failed the test and came on the books. And what I'm going to be talking about in this first example is how on-the-book PFI schemes are handled in national accounts. When a PFI scheme is on the books, what ONS does is to add an amount equal to the value of the capital asset, both to the public sector capital stock and to the public sector net liabilities. And at first sight, this looks very fair. You acquire an asset and you balance that with an equal and offsetting liability. The problem is that that process doesn't stand up so well when you actually look at how PFI schemes operate. Now, this is not an easy thing to do because the detail of PFI schemes is locked up in commerciality and confidence. But under freedom of information, you can at least start to prize out some of the financial detail associated with PFI schemes. And we obtained the financial projections for 8 PFI schemes, and we analysed those. And part of what we found, is this. Let me explain this slide. 8 PFI schemes are different rows there. The left-hand column is the amount of capital raised, the value of the capital asset in each scheme. So the first one is £189 million hospital. The middle column is the amount that the public sector client pays, but excluding what it pays for services. We're able to use the projections to strip out the payments for services and maintenance and life cycle costs and management fees, etc. So that amount is the total nominal payment, essentially for provision of the capital asset. And the third column says, well, okay, if you take that stream of payments, discount it back at 5%, which is what the government would have paid if it had been borrowing itself, you get a net present value, and the final column is the ratio of the net present value to the original capital value. Question immediately arises, why is the final column so much bigger than the original capital value? Well, two reasons. One is that the internal rate of return for the project was typically much higher than 5%. And secondly, the average outstanding debt in which that internal rate of return was being earned was typically fairly large over the life of the project. Well, what's the significance of that last column? If you look at the first case there, which is £189 million hospital, which is not a million miles from here, you'll see that what the public sector ended up paying had a net present value twice the original capital value. In other words, if it had borrowed the money itself, it could have borrowed, for what it contracted to pay, it could have borrowed twice the amount of capital that it actually got. Now, viewed in the light of those figures, those high figures in that last column, the ONS's decision to add to public sector net debt just the original capital value is, frankly, badly misleading and badly understates the actual commitment that the state is undertaking to fund the capital element of these schemes. But there's another implication as well. If you think back to the original test, I said that the original test for whether a scheme should be on or off the books is a risk-based test. Now, imagine I give you a tenner and say, look, here's £10, I don't want it back, but go down the road to the bookies and put it on the 330. Then what you're doing is you're having a flutter at my expense. You're not actually bearing any meaningful risk. Associated with these PFI schemes, there's very high levels of profit, which effectively swamp the risk margins assumed in the schemes. So what's really happening in these schemes, I would argue, is that the private sector is having a flutter at the public sector's expense, rather than meaningfully assuming risk. So I would argue that if these figures had been looked at by ONS, they would have re-examined their original risk test and assumed that most PFI schemes should actually have been on the books. So the first example, I argue, shows that ONS's way of treating PFI schemes and national accounts grossly understates the public sector's commitment. Moreover, when most PFI schemes come on the books as they're likely to do the change in accounting practices, the first problem, the understatement there, will not be corrected. Next example is to do with utility pricing. I'll do this one briefly. What we're talking about here is network utilities, things like water, electricity distribution, the rail network, and the major airports. In other words, the major capital infrastructure of the country. In the UK, most of these utilities are private, some of them are public. Water in Scotland, for example, is publicly owned, and water in England is privately owned. But what I'm going to say applies irrespective of whether we're talking about a private utility or a publicly owned utility. All utilities in the UK have a state-appointed regulator, and one of his jobs is to decide how much customers should pay to provide the capital assets of the utility. Now consider the nature of this decision. You've got a state appointee, so the state is effectively making a decision which puts an inescapable burden on consumers for the future. You can't choose not to use network utilities to provide the key capital, part of the key capital infrastructure of the country. That effectively is a taxation decision. And we would argue that the details of that decision should be reflected somewhere in official statistics. That is, how much capital is being provided like this, and crucially, what burden is being placed upon consumers through undertaking this, through this decision. Why is it important to know that? Well, because effectively, the burden you're placing on consumers preempts part of the tax-bearing capacity of the state. In Scotland, when you get your water bill, it comes with your council tax bill. But effectively, it's the same in England. The regulator in England is making the same decision, using the same pricing model, and having the same effect. So it's important to know, in terms of the burden placed on tax-bearing capacity, what decisions are actually being made. It's also important to know, to be able to cross-check whether the regulator is getting it right. Because the regulator is quite capable of getting this decision wrong, and indeed has done so in the UK. The pricing model that's used for UK utilities is based on current cost pricing, and actually means that when utilities build a capital asset, they get a windfall profit, which could well be of the order of 40% of the value of the capital asset. Now, no country can long afford to provide its infrastructure at 40% over cost. And secondly, that windfall profit is liable to distort the investment decisions made. So this is something that the public should know about. It should be reflected in official statistics. You can't rely on the regulators to cough this up, because they don't. And yet, there's a glaring gap in official statistics here. The third example I'm going to look at is funding the UK current account deficit. And I'm going to base this example upon a paper by Stephen Nicol in the Bank of England Quarterly Bulletin. Stephen Nicol is a very distinguished economist, former member of the Monetary Policy Committee, warden of Nuffield College. And he asked the question, what is the UK's current account deficit, and is its deficit sustainable? In 2005, which is the year he was looking at, the current account deficit was £31.9 billion. And Nicol, in his paper, produced the following table to show how that was funded. In the first column there, you've got the acquisition of UK assets by foreign residents. In other words, that's people either lending money to the UK or buying assets in the UK from abroad. The second column is the opposite, that's the acquisition of assets abroad by UK residents. And the excess of that over that funds the major part of the UK's current account deficit of 31.9 billion. Now these figures are interesting because they're staggeringly large. These figures, the 700 there and the 700 there, are of an order of magnitude equal to about 60% of GDP. Very big figures indeed. And this led Nickel, looking at figures like that, led Nickel to two key insights. The underlines in these quotations are by me. The first is that foreign assets and foreign liabilities have grown hugely to such an extent that the size of these stocks of foreign assets and liabilities is far higher in the UK than in any other country. In other words, we are out on a limb in terms of our exposure, as shown in Table 2. Second insight, the net portfolio of the UK is strongly positive in equity-type investments and strongly negative in debt-type investments. In other words, the UK is investing in equities abroad, by and large, and it's borrowing sort of deposits from abroad. And, as Nickel says, that's not dissimilar to a large bank. So in other words, here we have the UK operating like a large bank, and like the first quote, operating like, in a sense, the largest bank in the world. Well, what Nickel then did was to go on and say, is this position sustainable? And he came to the conclusion that this position probably was sustainable. He said that so long as average returns on equity-type assets continue to exceed average returns on debt-type assets, in other words, as long as we earn more on what we invest abroad compared with what we pay out from what we borrow from abroad, then the position is probably sustainable. And he went into a little bit more detail, but that effectively was what he was looking at. But if you think of the UK as a large bank, banks typically are exposed to three risks. First of all is credit risk. They invest in bad assets, subprime. Liquidity risk, that they're funding that investment by borrowing. What if their borrowing dries up? And thirdly, interest risk, that what they pay for their borrowing, in fact, it costs more than they're earning on their investments. And to those three risks, traditional risks for a bank, you'd add to the UK something complicated to do with exchange rates. Now, Nickel's analysis, in fact, concentrates only on, or mainly on that third risk there. In addition, he does a bit of analysis of an exchange rate risk, but that is a very unrealistic exchange rate risk where sterling appreciates permanently and dramatically. It's not very likely. So, in fact, Nickel's analysis of the sustainability of the UK deficit, current account deficit, doesn't actually address what must be very major risks indeed, like the credit risk, subprime, the liquidity risk. Investors in the UK take fright and don't invest in the UK. Why is that? I mean, this is not a criticism of Nickel, who's a brilliant economist. What it is a criticism of official statistics. Because in a sense, Nickel can only analyse what's available. It's Orwellian that his discourse is conditioned by the availability of the figures. And official statistics are more or less silent on the risks that the UK, as the largest bank in the world, would actually run. We've turned the UK economy into the largest bank in the world, but we've not developed a statistical framework which would enable us to assess the risks we're actually running. This is, I would argue, is a disastrous failing in official statistics. Okay, conclusions. First of all, you'll have noticed that my three examples are actually linked because one of the fundamental factors of which the credit of Bank UK is secured is the tax carrying capacity of the UK economy. And my first two examples show that actually the tax carrying capacity of the UK economy have been underestimated by official statistics. So the examples are linked. I could go on to other examples like contingent liabilities, public sector pensions, whether GDP has been presented misleadingly or not, but I won't. Instead, I'll draw three conclusions. First of all, in all the three examples I've looked at, the UK has been out there at the front of the field. We invented PFI. We also actually invented the current cost regulated capital value method of utility pricing, and as we've seen, we turned our economy into the largest bank in the world. So we've been out there pushing our economy into new fields. In those circumstances, I would argue that official statistics has the duty to be proactive and to keep up. it has actually failed badly in that duty. Secondly, all the three examples are characterised by a blurring of the line between the public and the private sector. There's been a tendency in UK official statistics to define the public sector very narrowly when assessing the strength of the UK's public finances. This has been, I would argue, extremely misleading. And third point is that when you challenge ONS, and there's a colourful debate with ONS, particularly about the PFI liabilities point, which you can access on our website, their first line of defence is, we were only obeying orders. We were following ISA 95, we were following this accounting standard, that accounting standard, we were bound by legal obligations. In fact, accounting rules should be continuously validated by cross-checking them against what happens in the real world. If they no longer describe adequately what's happening in the real world, then scrap the rule, or at least publish an ancillary analysis. ONS has been very bad at doing that. Okay, I've concluded. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you very much for giving me the invitation to come along this morning to speak on official statistics and, in fact, whether they provide an adequate basis for the debate about Scottish independence, broadening it actually to look not just at independence, but also at the continuation of devolution. It's obviously an appropriate time to speak on this, not least because last week Alex Salmond in the Scottish Parliament brought forward a bill to have a referendum on Scottish independence. Also, we're 10 years since the start of the new Scottish Parliament. Devolution is an ongoing process. This summer we had the Calman Review, which looked at extending or possibly extending tax powers to the new Scottish Parliament. And of course the RSS is having its conference in Edinburgh, so it's a fitting place to have the talk. Okay, so moving on, we're not going to manage this, I can see this. Yes. Okay. Right, thank you. Right. Obviously, whether or not Scotland becomes independent is a political issue, but statistics is incredibly important to the debate, and this has been clear since the 1990s when, under a Conservative government, the first publication of government expenditure and revenue statistics for Scotland came out. Immediately it was met by both sides of the debate as a political hot potato. This was, on one side, Scotland is a basket case, it cannot afford to go it alone, and on the other side, this just shows what a unionist administration is doing to Scotland, and what we really need is independence to clear the field. Very few people, but some people did start to look at the statistics and say, well, are the statistics worth having? And after all, that was the main part of the debate. There was very little that could actually be done, despite some publications during the 1990s on the quality of the statistics, because many of the estimates were indeed estimates with little information available on the variation that was in these estimates. However, things changed dramatically in 2005 with the Freedom of Information Bill. And the reason it changed so dramatically was that GERS, to a large extent, on the expenditure side of information, is heavily based on the public expenditure statistical analysis as provided by the Treasury Department. And the Treasury, believe it or not, had conducted this exercise with the various departments in the United Kingdom, passed out the relevant bit of information to each in turn, got the information back and produced PESA, but at no time had released the detail of the entire database to any one department. But in 2005, following a Freedom of Information request, we were granted the entire database. And at the same time, individual departments for the first time got the database. So things changed at that particular time. What we need official statistics for, if we're looking to measure the important aspects, what desirable qualities we want from statistics, if we're trying to look at the independence debate, obviously we're wanting accuracy. And so with accuracy comes knowing what the data is based on and how it's been collected and how it's been collated. The statistics have to be what it says on the label. You should be able, confidently be able to say, if that says this is the amount of money which Scotland spends on industry or supporting enterprise, it should be reasonably accurate to what it is. The statistics should not be easily open to misinterpretation. For example, if you think you are calculating the current deficit for Scotland, the budgetary deficit, then it should be the current budgetary deficit. It shouldn't actually be some other statistic entirely. And it should be possible, so that you can do some cross-checking, to be able to link the tables that you have with some other tables, other sources in the way around. What we found in our work on GERS was on government expenditure and revenue statistics and on public expenditure statistical analysis, which were the two main data sources of interest in the independence devolution debate, was that none of these characteristics systematically held throughout the publications. What was that we did? Do we see? Right. In Scotland, by the way, we have this list of the major statistics that are available on the way through. I'm going to concentrate on the last three of these: government expenditure and revenues in Scotland, the PESA data from the Treasury, and what's called the government funding statement, which is how they decide, or the publication that gives information on what money is reserved for the United Kingdom and what is devolved, and it gives it by programme, by various headings. The first four items on that list, considerable work is done by Scottish statisticians on, that is Scottish government statisticians, on all of the first four. It's not that there aren't difficulties with them, it's not that fantastic difficulties haven't been overcome, but it's we're short of time, so concentrating on the last three that's there. Now, GERS actually, which is a short name for the Government Expenditure and Revenue Statistics, not Rangers, and on that particular one, we started studying it in 1997, and at that particular time concentrated on the revenue side. So if you can remember the financial statement that comes out from the UK government every year, and they look at how much money is coming in taxation and how much is going out in expenditure. A similar exercise, or one like it, was being conducted therefore in Scotland. When it came to the taxation side, or the revenue side, remember most of the taxes, the tax base and the tax rates, are determined at UK level. It's only local taxes such as business rates and council tax that are done at a local level. So on the revenue side, what was happening was in order to get the Scottish estimates, most of them were done either on a population level or in some sample surveys. On the expenditure side, the data primarily came from the Treasury's own exercise, as we described on public expenditure. We found, as I said, we could only study that expenditure side in 2005, and at that particular time, some glaring errors came through. Now, a lot of these have actually been corrected, but I think it's important to realise that unless the public has, and individual departments, has an opportunity to look into data, then there's every chance that there'll be huge errors in there, and accuracy must be part of the game of statistics. If I can concentrate just on a couple of them. For example, when the Scottish statisticians looked at providing an estimate of how much was spent on justice, they looked at how much the Scottish Executive spent, and then they looked at, which was what's called identifiable to Scotland. But within the public expenditure statistics analysis, there's a group which is called non-identifiable to the United Kingdom. In fact, this group of expenditure was not just non-identifiable to the United Kingdom, but also included at that time non-identifiable to any of the regions in England. In other words, it was identifiable, or any expenditure under those headings could be identified to Scotland and added into Scotland, as it was done. But of the bit that was left, it was non-identifiable and had to be prorated out, if anyone was interested, among the regions of England. But since it hadn't been made clear in PESA, the Scottish executive statisticians took a proportion of that expenditure and added it into the Scottish data. Essentially, that was approximately of the order in the UK of £4.4 billion worth of expenditure was then allocated out, and part of it was allocated in the Scottish executive's document to Scotland. No one noticed. And that went on because the Scottish executive did not have the basic data that was underlying it. We also saw on the way through that the Department of Works and Pensions allocated some of its expenditure to Scotland, whereas in fact the Scots had already been allocated their expenditure at a different level. So there were mistakes like this occurring through the document. Another problem on the way through was the treatment of North Sea oil in the publication, and this was what I mean. Statistics was actually giving you the opportunity of misrepresenting what was actually happening. What the document said quite clearly was that using ESA 95, the rule was that North Sea oil, being part of the continental shelf, was not actually strictly part of Scottish affairs. In fact, what item 1 on the ESA 95 says is that when you're presenting from the UK, the data for the UK to go in with the rest of Europe, then you miss out the bit of the continental shelf. It gets dealt with separately. But within the country itself, it is up to you to determine whether you put North Sea oil with a particular region or not. So again, a false reason was given for the treatment. And finally, and the last point I want to mention is that what happened at the end was that the GERS document produced a general government borrowing requirement. It took total expenditure, subtracted off total revenues, usually found there was a big deficit, and that was a general government borrowing requirement. But they repeatedly in the newspapers, I don't mean the Scottish executive themselves, but the newspapers frequently compared that figure with the financial statements current balance, and repeatedly therefore found Scotland wanting in a basket case. And there was very little ever done by official statisticians to counter what was happening in the newspapers and this flurry of activity. As I said, one side saying we're a basket case, the other one side saying how awful the union is doing for us. Well, actually, many of these errors in GERS subsequently have indeed been improved. But there's still an awful lot to be done if we're interested in really informing the debate on Scottish independence. There is no full set of integrated government accounts. We need information on trade flows, oil, non-oil and oil related. And speaking on the trade flows, HMRC produces, through Customs and Excise, information on trade flows to Scotland, imports and exports. It says that it's within the scope of national statistics, as indeed are PESA, most of PESA and GERS. In other words, it's produced to a high professional standard as set out in the Code of Practice. In the first publications of this Customs and Excise information, a large part of the unknown trade was actually put into one postcode in Aberdeen. It was a useful thing to deposit in there. Unfortunately, when that meant that we were doing country analysis, Scottish trade in particular products was unbelievable. That got cleared, but at the same time, we now have, for example, in the latest edition of this quarter, that Scotland's exports represent 5.5% of the UK. This is in manufacturing and not services. And its imports are 3.1%. I think any statistician looking at those with a knowledge of the Scottish economy would query the value of any of these statistics, and should we in fact be paying for them. They're really needing a lot of analysis. Right. I should also say in PESA that it says in the description of PESA that these statistics are used by statisticians, government officials, independent researchers, etc., and yet it would be impossible to compare the amount of money spent in Scotland on enterprise and industry with the figures that are coming from any other region, because they have been totally unable to work out whether the amount being spent by Scottish enterprise and Highlands and Islands enterprise belongs to industry or belongs to employment on its way through. So these problems like that have repeatedly come up in the past. Okay. Moving on to PESA, as we've said, we still have problems in the allocation of expenditure to categories, and the main problem with PESA is that in its identifiable expenditure, what it says is actually spent, or they've identified as being spent in Scotland or one of the English regions or Wales or Northern Ireland, you can't actually determine how much of that money was devolved spending and how much of it was what's called reserved spending. Now, reserved spending is that amount of money that's held by Whitehall departments for the benefit of the whole United Kingdom. So a Whitehall department has two roles. It's usually looking after the whole of the United Kingdom, and it's also got responsibilities for England or England and Wales. It becomes very difficult if you're a statistician or an employee in one of those departments to actually identify whether the work that you're doing is specifically for England or England and Wales or for the whole of the United Kingdom. If I give you one example in tourism, the tourism strategy for England, with its foreword at that time by Tony Blair, says in the front of it that this strategy, which by the way was a reserved function and therefore for the whole of the United Kingdom, although it was only an English strategy, was really a pretty good strategy, and although it was only for England, he was sure that it would be relevant to Scotland and Wales as well. Now that is really mind-blowing, given the different people who go to Scotland who are interested in England and who are interested in Wales. You don't actually pick up a book on France, on tourism in France, and say, this will be relevant for Germany as well. Okay? So we've got a big problem in identifying devolved expenditure for England. And until we can do that, we're never actually going to be able to be sure that Whitehall departments are adequately reflecting what is devolved and what is reserved. And we have suggested a way in which that might be done, because the Treasury also issues, usually every 2 years, a Treasury funding statement which shows how much money is going to, of every English department, what proportion of that spend is actually devolved or and should be going to Scotland. So, for example, in education, most of the education department's functions are devolved. In trade and industry, very little is devolved. Most of it remains as a reserved function. And you can work out which of these headings are devolved. Unfortunately, the headings in the Treasury funding statement don't match up with any of the headings in PESA, and it's therefore very difficult to work out whether a Whitehall department is actually fulfilling its reserved functions. Until that's fixed, we have really no idea how to do a comparison for many of the topics between Scotland and England. So when you see the detail in The Guardian or whatever, comparing Scottish expenditure with English expenditure, there are big problems with it for many of the headings. And finally, if I can say that this summer, on another topic, that there was a Kalman review carried out its primary aim was to increase the accountability of the Scottish Parliament. It wasn't supported by those who were interested in independence in Scotland. It was a unionist grouping that got together for that one, and they took information from many people in Scotland and decided that one of the recommendations that would be useful would be to improve accountability, that there ought to be tax-raising powers in Scotland, and what would happen would be that the block grant to Scotland would be reduced, and the Scottish Parliament would then have the onus of responsibility of increasing taxes. When you actually look at the mathematics of that, as Jim did, it turns out on the way through that there's a whole area in which it is possible for action to be taken by the Scottish executive, by the Scottish Government, which would apparently improve the economy, such as a reduction in tax. But over a certain range of elasticities, that reduction in tax would actually improve the position for the economy, and so far as there's more employment, and therefore improve the tax take by HM Treasury, but it might not be sufficient to improve the tax take of the Scottish Government. In other words, the lowering of tax would not call forth sufficient employment opportunities that the overall tax take would improve for Scotland. We went in to speak about this to the Scotland office, and the point came over very clearly that they neither had statistics, nor indeed had it been properly thought through what the effect would be if there was a change of tax in Scotland next door to the rest of the United Kingdom, which did not have the tax change. There were no statistics available to help the matter out. And that being the case, I just want to make the final point that even where no official statistics are available, we believe there's still a role for official statisticians to at least do the mathematics and point out the problem areas. And it was quite clear that this group hadn't thought of it at all. In fact, we were asked if there's anything else that we point out, could we? Okay. And finally, the most important bit, our website. Thank you very much.
Right, well, my talk's going to be rather a little bit different, because I'm talking a bit about what the Royal Statistical Society is doing in respect of official statistics, and also what we're aiming for. Can you hear me all right at the back? Good, okay. Obviously, official statistics, or statistics about the measurement of the economy and society, have been an interest of the RSS since its foundation, although the way it was handled in the 19th century was obviously very different to today, when we have a formal official, very comprehensive official statistical system. The RSS interest is actually multifaceted. We have, for example, and obviously a number of members who are government statisticians, so the Society has responsibilities to them. We have members who work with official statisticians. I suspect most RSS members use official statistics to a greater or lesser extent in the course of their work, so they could argue there's another issue there. We have an official statistics section about to be reinvigorated, which organises meetings, or I believe it will be organising meetings on official statistics. And of course, other statistics, we have a social statistics section, which will also clearly have an interest. But I'm going to talk about the rest of the other things, two other elements of the RSS, which are looking rather more at the sort of overarching policy and other issues. And that's the National Statistics Working Party, which I chair, and the Statistics User Forum, on which I sit representing the Society of Business Economists, and Jenny Church, who's in the audience there, is the theme director for that. Andrew Dilnott, who's the chair, sadly can't be with us this week. I'm going to come back to stuff because that's going to come into my talk a bit later, but let's start with the National Statistics Working Party. It's a working party, so it's a temporary thing by definition, although it's been going rather a long time, as some people say. I think it started about 10 years ago. Didn't he? Yeah, anyway. We have currently a 3-year mandate running covering 2009, 10 and 11, which is to develop RSS general policy regarding official statistics, to monitor major developments, to lobby as appropriate, to provide briefing material as needed for parliamentarians, media and other interested parties, to support the President and others, and obviously we have to take account of the interests of the other parts of the RSS. The biggest thing I think we did, the NSWP has followed the whole process of the development, the changes in the organisation of official statistics, including notably, of course, the Statistics and Registration Service Act of 2007. And under Tim Holt, who was both David's predecessor as president and my predecessor as chair of the NSWP, a huge amount of work was done in respect of that legislation. The lobbying that was done by the RSS, by the Statistics Commission, and also by the Statistics User Forum did, I think it's pretty clear it did have an effect in making some rather important changes to the legislation, which actually improved it and made it more workable. Well, the legislation is passed, but the task isn't finished, because given the devolved, given the decentralised nature of official statistics, and given what the legislation does, you have the UK Statistics Authority, but it has formal power only over the Office for National Statistics and not over the other, 200 or so bodies which collect official statistics that have been identified. It can influence, it has various powers that are, in relation to the Code of Practice and the assessment, which can help, but it cannot command. So a lot depends on the structures and the practices that are put in place as a result of the legislation. And that is an ongoing process. I'm sure a number of you heard Michael Scholar yesterday. The UKSA is starting on that route, and I think he feels we're being helpful. We have supported the UKSA in some of the developments, but we are, as the title of this this session says, we regard ourselves as a critical friend. Karen will tell you we can be critical, I'm sure. So what are we aiming for? Well, we have a document called the Vision for Official Statistics. I haven't got a proper copy, but it looks a bit like this. I hope there are some copies around. This again was something Michael Scholar mentioned yesterday, and we drew this up. John Pullinger, one of my colleagues on the NSWP, was the main person who did most of the work on this. And this actually sets out what we're aiming to do and how we feel statistics should evolve. Against the background that we do have problems of trust in the UK, which don't reflect the quality of the statistics, and also bearing in mind the sentence, taking a statement from the Act, that the goal is to ensure that agreed statistical information is used to serve the public good. So the first thing we have in here is actually that the statistical system needs to look at continuous engagement with all users. And this, of course, is where I want to talk about the Statistics User Forum, which is the main activity so far. Now, the Statistics User Forum, in a sense, replaced the former Statistics User Council. And it was established in 2004. It is essentially a collection of the user groups on official statistics. So you've got the health statistics user groups, the fire statistics user groups, well over 20 who are members of SUF. So what it is seeking to do is to represent their overarching interests, not the day-to-day interests. That's up to each individual group to sort out with the official statisticians, but to look at the overarching or the strategic interest of this. Up to now, it has been funded by, or largely funded, not entirely funded, by money from the ESRC, and it is, but formally it is part of the RSS, although in some senses it's rather a different to the usual RSS themes. We've recently there has been a major development in the funding of the user forum. in addition to a new grant that we're getting from the ESRC, the UK Statistics Authority has agreed to second one person, Liam Murray, and he is about to start working for the Statistics User Forum, and that's going to make a major change, a major improvement in the capability of the forum to act. So what are we planning to do? Well, as I said, it was the strategic interest, and I think one of the things that first started off when we had SUF was that the working parties the user groups work at what you might call a working level. So the strategic interest was lacking. Karen Dunnell recognised that as well, and we set up, therefore, regular meetings at a strategic level between Karen and some of her senior colleagues and between the Statistics User Forum to discuss the overarching interests. And we're very grateful that despite all the pressures on Karen and the ONS throughout the legislation process, and although obviously we couldn't do everything that I think any of us all wanted to do, we kept that going through that as part of Karen's legacy. That needs to be extended because in practice it's largely reflected ONS, so it needs to go out to the rest of the GSS. I'm not sure what we do with regarding devolved administrations, because obviously you have Scottstat in Scotland and other organisations, but there is a question there for the future. But the Statistics User Forum represents essentially what I call professional users of statistics, those who use it in the course of their working life. Now, there are other users. There are what we call the big beasts. These are central government departments or the Bank of England who have service agreements with the Office for National Statistics or indeed government departments. Well, they, of course, look after themselves. It is arguable, I think, that they have too much influence, but that's one issue. There are indirect users. There are the media who are important, but I think the key group we're looking at next are what we call citizen users, the individual who wants to look at school league tables, know what the crime is like, what is about the inflation rate or the hospital waiting lists. There is a huge need to consider. Nobody knows what these users' needs are. They're obviously a difficult group to monitor. I know it's something the Government Statistical Service is also concerned about. We came up in a meeting we had with Jill Matheson, the new national statistician, yesterday. So the big challenge for SUF is now to, and hopefully now that we've got the additional support from Liam, is to reach out to those users. So I think that's what I need to say about the user issue, but users is not the only thing. Communication related to users is also important. I'm not going to mention the ONS website, but I think, again, part of the whole reaching out to users is improving communication. What else are we looking for? Well, I think another area where the UK statistics has been weak in the past is in the planning. Now, here again, Karen has stepped in, and Karen and her colleagues have started to set up a new planning system. Well, that's early days, so we'll have to wait to see how that develops. Then there is the use of statistics. There is arguing on behalf of statistics with other parts of Whitehall. David has written a couple of letters this year to Sir Gus O'Donnell, one on following the knife crime affair, which you heard about yesterday, so I'm not going to go into it because of time, and the other when Gus O'Donnell made a remark that official statisticians should be boring. We didn't like that either, and I think he has backed down from that, which is good. But apart from the other parts of Whitehall, there's also the parliamentary interest. Now, obviously we engage with the Public Administration Select Committee, which is the body that Parliament has decided will oversee the whole statistical system. But there is more to that. And one great, what we hope is going to be a development in the future, is that we might get an all-party parliamentary group on statistics. Lord Lipsey, who is the inspiration behind straight statistics, is very keen on this and is going to try to get sufficient support in Parliament to set this up. and the RSS will obviously support it. Now, that is not just for looking at issues with official statistics. It can go obviously much, much wider, and it should. But certainly we hope that we'll get more, foster and maintain and help parliamentary interest in official statistics develop, because ultimately the UK Statistics Authority reports to Parliament. Now here, of course, I've just like any London-centric person, I've talked about Parliament meaning the Westminster Parliament, and I'm leaving it to you in Scotland, as we're in Edinburgh, to tell us what, if anything, we should be doing. Because again, you know, we're at early days here with the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Assembly and so forth. And the final thing that we are trying to do at the moment, again, I think this came up in Michael's talk yesterday, we have written to a number of politicians in major parties, asking for meetings with them ahead of the election, hoping to get ideally something in their manifesto, but also to lobby them on the importance of the policy that they have for statistics. Two key points here, not the only ones, but maintaining the independence of statistics and the integrity of statistics. Integrity, I think, will be a theme of this election, given all the issues with spin and so forth. So there's an obvious synergy there. And also pointing out that given the very hard choices that are going to have to be made on public spending, this is exactly where you need good information and therefore good statistics.